Here's the tightened version. The hook, 150 words, and the ending are untouched. Every cut comes from trimming redundancy in the middle chapters, and all key beats remain. A boot slammed into a stack of cedar planks and sent them sliding down the mud. Rain hammered the riverbank. An old man dropped to his knees in the muck and started gathering them back, one board at a time. His hands shook. His knuckles were swollen and stiff. Behind him, a one-eyed bloodhound stood guard and growled low at the men laughing from the road. They pointed. They called him crazy. They said the old fool had finally cracked. He didn't look up. He just kept hauling those planks toward the bend in the water, where he meant to raise a tall wooden cross. His name was Silas Cruz, and the whole town thought he was building a monument to his own madness. That same night, that cross would save 40 lives. What those 40 men did next still echoes along the Callaway River. Stay with me on this. To understand that night, you have to understand the man and the silence he lived in. For 40 years, Silas Cruz lived alone in a tin-roof shack on a rise above the Callaway River. Backwoods, Tennessee. The kind of place where the road turns to gravel, then to dirt, then to nothing at all. He had no phone. He had no neighbors close enough to hear him if he hollered. What he had was a dog named Gideon, a one-eyed bloodhound with a gray muzzle and a bad hip, and the two of them got along just fine without the rest of the world. The town down the valley called him the River Hermit. They called him the broken old fool. Some of the younger ones had never heard him speak a full sentence, and they figured he couldn't. He was half deaf in one ear, and he leaned in when people talked, and that lean made him look slow. It wasn't slow. It was a man straining to hear a world that had mostly stopped talking to him. Here's the thing about Silas. He didn't ask anybody for anything. Not once in 40 years. When his roof leaked, he climbed up and fixed it himself, even with hands that barely closed. When his truck died, he let it die and he walked. When folks in town looked through him like he was made of glass, he let them. He had learned a long time ago that the cheapest thing in the world is other people's opinion of you, and the town gave that opinion freely. There was a Sunday, years back, when Silas walked into the church at the bottom of the valley just once, just to sit in the back and hear the singing. A woman in the third pew turned around and looked at him, mud on his boots and a beard down his chest, and she pulled her 2 children close like he was a wolf coming out of the cold. Nobody said hello. He sat through one hymn, and then he stood up quiet and walked back out into the rain, 4 miles home, and he never went back. He didn't hold it against them. He wasn't theirs, and they weren't his, and that was that. He came back from Vietnam in 1971, and he came back wrong, the way a lot of them did. Not wrong in the body, wrong in the quiet. He had been a medic over there. He had knelt in mud just like this mud, with rain coming down just like this rain, and he had held boys together with his bare hands while the world came apart around them. Some of those boys lived. A lot of them didn't. And when he got home, the country he'd bled for didn't want to look at him. People crossed the street. People spat. A man in an airport called him a name Silas never repeated to a living soul. So he found a piece of land nobody wanted, above a river nobody fished, and he disappeared into it. That was the deal he made with himself. You don't need them. You never did. There were nights, though, when the war came back. He'd wake in the dark with his heart going like a hammer and his hands already moving, already reaching for a wound that wasn't there. Gideon learned those nights. The old dog would climb up onto the foot of the bed, bad hip and all, and lay his heavy head on the old man's chest until the breathing slowed. That was the whole of Silas Cruz's family. 1 broken dog and 1,000 ghosts. And he'd made his peace with both. By that spring, Silas was getting on. His arthritis had gotten so bad some mornings he couldn't lift a coffee cup with one hand. He'd wrap both around it and bring it to his mouth slow. The river that year ran low and brown, and the air had that heavy, waiting feeling that older folks in those hills knew to respect. Silas knew it too. He'd watch the sky in the evening and shake his head and mutter one word to the dog. Coming. Gideon would thump his tail once like he understood. The town didn't watch the sky. The town was busy laughing at the old man, because around that time Silas started doing something nobody could make sense of. He started buying cedar. He'd walk the 4 miles into town, slow, leaning on a stick, and he'd count out crumpled bills for cedar planks. Long ones. Good ones. The clerk, a kid named Donnie, rang him up and watched him strap a plank to an old handcart and start the long walk back, and Donnie told everybody who'd listen. The hermit's buying lumber. What's a man got to build out there all alone with nobody to build it for? They guessed. A coffin, somebody said, and they laughed. Maybe he's finally making his own box. The men at the feed store thought that one was hilarious. One of them did an impression of the old man, leaning and shuffling, dragging an invisible cart, and the whole place howled. They didn't know how close to right they were. Silas wasn't building a coffin. He was building a cross. And he had his reasons, reasons that came from a place so deep he never could have explained them to a single laughing soul in that town even if they'd asked. Which they didn't. They never asked Silas Cruz anything. That was the whole problem, and that was the whole point. The morning he started, the sky was the color of an old bruise. Silas had hauled the last of the cedar down to the bend in the river, the spot where the road from the north came down close to the water before it climbed back up toward the washed gravel of the bridge. It was the lowest, meanest stretch of that whole road. When the river rose, that bend went under first, and the little knoll where Silas stood became an island. He didn't know why he picked that spot. He'd tell you later he just knew. Something in him, some old voice he hadn't heard since the war, said here, and he listened. He'd stopped arguing with that voice a long time ago. The last time he'd ignored it, a boy had died who might have lived. He never made that mistake twice. He worked all day in the rising wind. And let me tell you, it was not easy work for a man whose hands had quit on him. He laid out his tools and started cutting the joint where the crossbeam would meet the upright. His saw slipped. His fingers wouldn't grip. He'd cut halfway through a notch and have to stop and shake the cramp out of his hand and wait for the feeling to crawl back into it. He dropped the chisel twice and had to lower himself all the way down into the mud to find it, and getting back up took everything he had. He bled where the saw caught the back of his thumb, and he wrapped it in a rag and kept on, because bleeding was an old friend, and it never once stopped him from finishing a job. Gideon watched from a dry patch under a cedar, head on his paws, one good eye following every move. That was when the truck came down the road, 3 of them in it, young men with nothing to do on a wet afternoon. They slowed when they saw him, and they rolled the window down, and one leaned out. "Hey, old man, what is that, a scarecrow?" They laughed. Another one threw a beer can. It bounced off the planks. "Praying for company, Cruz, ain't nobody coming." And the one driving gunned the engine and swerved close, and his tire caught the edge of Silas's neat stack of cedar and sent it sliding down into the mud. That's where our story started, right there. Silas got down on his knees in the muck and gathered the boards back, one at a time, and he did not look up, and Gideon stood between him and the road and growled from somewhere deep in his chest. The men laughed harder. One of them hollered something about the old man talking to his dog because nobody else would have him. Then they got bored, the way cruel men do, and they drove on toward the bridge, found it washed half out, cussed, and turned around and roared back the other way. They never gave the old fool another thought. They couldn't have told you his name an hour later. Silas wiped the rain out of his eyes and kept working. It took him until almost dark to dig the hole. He dug it deep, down past the soft mud into the hard clay, because some part of him knew this thing had to stand against more than wind. He stopped twice to lean on the shovel and catch his breath, and his heart did a strange flutter both times, and he ignored it the way he ignored most things his body told him. Then came the hard part, raising it. The cross was tall, taller than a man twice over, and heavy with rain. He got his shoulder under the crossbeam and he pushed, and his knees buckled, and it slid back down. He tried again. It slid again, and this time it took a strip of skin off his shoulder going down. The third time, Silas Cruz, 70-some years old, half-deaf, with hands that wouldn't close, let out a sound that wasn't a word, a sound that was 40 years of being looked through, and he drove that cross up out of the mud with everything left in him and dropped the base into the hole. It stood. He packed the clay around it with his boots and his bare hands until it would not move. Then he kicked the dirt down hard and tested it with both arms, throwing his whole weight against it, and it did not give an inch. Then he sat down in the wet grass, and he started to laugh, soft and tired, and the dog came and put his big head in the old man's lap. The rain had eased to a drizzle. The light was going purple over the hills. And Silas looked up at the cross standing tall and pale against the dark, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. He felt finished, like he'd done the one last thing he was put here to do. "There," he said to Gideon, "it's done now, we can go home." And he believed it. He honestly believed his work was over. He walked back up to the shack with the dog at his heel, and he washed the mud off his hands, and he ate a cold supper, and he went to bed thinking he'd built a thing for no reason but the voice that told him to. He was wrong. His work hadn't even started. The storm came at midnight, and it came like the end of the world. It wasn't rain anymore. It was a wall of water falling out of the sky, the kind of storm that drops 6 inches in 3 hours and turns a quiet brown river into a brown monster. Silas woke to the roar of it on the tin roof and to Gideon standing at the door, hackles up, that one good eye fixed on the dark, making a sound the old man had never heard him make in all their years. Not a bark, a long, rising howl. Down on the river road, 4 miles of bad luck were rolling straight into a trap. 40 motorcycles. A full chapter of Hell's Angels, riding hard through the night, trying to beat the storm to the county line. They'd come up from the south, big men on big machines, leather and chrome and noise, the kind of men a town locks its doors against. They came around the bend in the dark, and the lead rider hit his brakes, and the whole pack stacked up behind him in a screaming tangle of headlights and skidding tires because the road ahead was gone. The bridge had washed clean out, and behind them the water they'd just ridden through was rising over the road, cutting off the way back. 40 men, stalled bikes in a foot of water that was turning into 2 feet while they stood there. No phones that worked out there. No high ground they could see. The current was strong enough now to knock a man down. One rider went to walk back the way they'd come, and the water took his legs out from under him and carried him 10 feet before 2 others grabbed him. These were hard men, men who feared almost nothing on this earth, and I will tell you the truth, they were starting to be afraid. Their leader was a man they called Tank, 60 years old, built like a refrigerator, a gray beard down to his chest, and a face that had seen everything. He stood in the rising water and turned a slow circle and could not find a single thing to save his men. The dark was total. The rain killed the headlights at 20 feet. He thought about the 40 men he was responsible for, men whose kids he knew, men who'd buried each other and bled for each other, and he thought, standing in that black water, that he was going to watch them drown one by one, and there wasn't a thing in the world he could do about it. And the river kept coming. That's when Gideon's howl reached them. It cut through the storm, long and mournful, from somewhere up the bank. Tank's head snapped toward it. "There's something up there," he shouted. And the men looked, and through a break in the rain, lit by a flicker of lightning, they saw it. High on a knoll, the only ground for a mile that the water hadn't touched, stood a tall wooden cross, pale and steady against the black sky. And below it, swinging a lantern back and forth, was the shape of an old man and a dog. Silas had seen the headlights stack up at the bend from his window. He didn't know who they were. He didn't care who they were. He knew only one thing: the thing he'd known since 1971. There were men in the water, and a man in the water needs a hand. He'd pulled his boots on over bare feet and grabbed his lantern and gone out into the worst storm in 40 years without a second's thought for himself. His lantern was now the second brightest thing on that whole river, and the brightest was the cross that the town had laughed at, catching every flash of lightning and throwing it back, a beacon you could not miss. Up here, Silas was hollering, his voice cracked and small against the storm. "Leave the bikes, get to the cross, come to the cross." And 40 Hell's Angels, who feared nothing, started climbing toward an old man they'd never met. Now, before I tell you what happened on that hill, do me one favor. If you're still with me, if your heart is in this story the way mine is, take 1 second and hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one about the people the world threw away only get told if folks like you stick around to hear them. That's it. That's the only thing I'll ask. Now let's get back to the river, because the night was a long way from over. They came up out of the water one at a time, and it was not easy. The current at the bottom of that knoll was a living thing, pulling at their boots, dragging the bikes off their stands and tumbling them downstream into the dark. You could hear the machines going, that grinding crash of metal in the water, $40,000 of chrome rolling away like driftwood, and not one man looked back at them. 2 of the younger riders went down and went under, and Silas saw it. And Silas, who could barely walk, started down the bank toward them. Tank grabbed him by the arm. "No, old man, we've got them." And the big men formed a chain, hand to wrist, leather to leather, the strongest at the bottom with the water to their chests, and they hauled their brothers up out of the brown water choking and alive. Silas met them at the top with the lantern. "This way. There's shelter. Move, move, you'll freeze." And he led them, this drowned army of outlaws, up the last of the rise to his shack and his lean-to and the old barn behind it, the only dry ground left in the world. 40 men do not fit in a one-room shack. Silas knew it. He put the worst-off ones inside, the 2 who'd gone under and an older rider whose lips had gone blue, and he stripped the wet leather off them with his ruined hands and wrapped them in every blanket and quilt he owned. He pulled the coat off his own back and put it over the blue-lipped man. He built the wood stove up till it roared, and the cast iron glowed dull red. He had a pot of beans and a pot of coffee going inside of 20 minutes, and he carried it out to the men packed into the barn, and he poured it into the only cups he had and passed them down the line, 1 cup, refilled 40 times. When the coffee ran out, he put more on. When the beans ran out, he opened the last cans he had in the house, the ones meant to get him through to the next walk into town, and he never once thought about that. Tank watched all of it. He watched this old man, this stranger, this man who had every reason in the world to bar his door against a gang of Hell's Angels, give away everything he had without being asked, and without asking for one thing back. And Tank, who was not a man who cried, felt his eyes sting. "Why?" he finally said. He'd come into the shack and found Silas kneeling by the blue-lipped rider, 2 fingers on the man's throat, counting his pulse with the steady calm of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. "Why are you doing all this? You don't know us. People like us, folks usually lock the door." Silas didn't look up from his counting. "Man's in trouble, you help him," he said. "Don't matter who he is. I learned that a long way from here." Then he looked up, and the lantern light caught his face, and Tank saw the dog tags. They'd slipped out of the old man's collar when he bent over the rider. Worn flat, near unreadable, but Tank knew what they were the second he saw them. "You served," Tank said quietly. "Medic," said Silas. 69 to 71, 1st Cavalry. He went back to his counting. "This one'll be all right, he's coming back. Get more coffee in him." The barn had gone quiet behind them because the word had passed man to man, the way it does. "Medic, First Cav. And these 40 hard men, you have to understand who a lot of them were. More than half that chapter were veterans themselves. Vietnam, some of them. The very war Silas had bled in. They'd come home to the same closed doors, the same crossed streets, the same country that didn't want to look at them, and they'd found each other on the road because the road was the only family that would have them. They knew exactly what it was to be looked through. They'd built their whole lives out of men the world had thrown away. One of the older riders pushed forward through the crowd in the doorway. Big man, gray ponytail, a tremor in his hands. He stared at Silas a long moment, and his face had gone strange, like a man hearing a song he hadn't heard since he was young. And then he said a name, a place, a firebase, a hill with a number, a date in 1970. Silas went still. "You were there," the rider said. His voice broke. "I was 19 years old and I had a hole in me you could put your fist through, and a medic from the first Kev kept me alive on a mountain for 6 hours till the bird came. I never saw his face. It was dark. It was raining, just like tonight." He took a step closer. "He kept telling me to stay with him. Just stay with me, son, the bird's coming," over and over. "I've heard that voice in my sleep for 30 years. He swallowed hard. "I spent all that time wondering who you were so I could say thank you. I never could find you. I figured you were dead." The room did not make a sound. The only thing you could hear was the storm and the wood stove and the rain on the tin. Silas looked at him, and something in the old man's chest, some door that had been locked for 40 years, came open. "Long time ago," he managed. "Wasn't to me," the rider said, and he dropped down onto one knee in front of the old man, this huge tattooed outlaw, and he took Silas's ruined hand in both of his, careful as you'd hold a bird. Thank you. I got kids. I got grandkids. I got a whole life I wasn't supposed to have, and it's because of you. Every good day I ever had you gave me." And then Tank knelt too. And then, one by one, all through that barn in the rain, 40 Hell's Angels went down on a knee in front of an old man the town called a broken fool. Not because anybody told them to, because some debts are too big to pay standing up. And Silas, who had not been touched in kindness by another human being in longer than he could remember, sat there in the lantern light with his hand in a stranger's hands and finally, quietly, began to weep. The storm blew itself out by morning. The river crested just below the knoll, just below the cross, and started falling. It had risen 40 feet that night. Every man who'd stalled at that bend would have drowned in the dark, and they all knew it. And the only reason they didn't was an old man's lantern and across the whole town had laughed at. They stayed 3 days. Couldn't leave if they'd wanted to, with the road out and the bridge gone. So they made themselves useful, the way good men do. They fixed Silas's roof, did it right. With new tin, 2 of them rode out for the second the road was passable. They got down in the river mud and hauled up what bikes they could find. And the ones they couldn't they let the river keep. They split a winter's worth of firewood and stacked it higher than the shack. They patched the barn and rehung the door and fixed the old truck that had sat dead for years, just so the old man would never have to walk to town again if he didn't want to. The 2 who'd nearly drowned wouldn't leave the old man's side, fetching his coffee, easing him into his chair, and Silas, who'd done everything alone for 40 years, let them. That was its own kind of miracle, if you ask me. The letting. And here's the part the town never lived down. When the road finally cleared, those 40 Hell's Angels did not just ride away. They rolled into town first, all 40 of them, thunder rolling up Main Street, and the whole place came out to gawk and lock their doors. The men parked in a long row in front of the hardware store, the very store where they'd rung up an old man's cedar and laughed about coffins. Tank walked in and put a thick roll of cash on the counter in front of Donnie the clerk and the owner both, and he said, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear every word, "You know Silas Cruz, the man you call the fool. He saved 40 of our lives 3 nights ago with a cross you laughed at. So I want every one of you to hear me. From here on, that man does not pay for a thing in this town. Not lumber, not food, not gas, nothing. And if I hear one of you laughed at him again, I'll be coming back to talk about it. You could have heard a pin drop on Main Street. And in the back of that crowd stood one of the 3 young men from the truck, the one who'd swerved at the planks, and his face had gone white as a sheet, and he never said a cruel word about Sila's cruise again as long as he lived. They didn't laugh at Sila's after that. They couldn't. The story got out, the way the true ones do, and people drove from 3 counties to see the cross at the bend. And somebody from the paper came, and somebody from the church, that same church that pulled its children away from him. And for the first time in 40 years, the broken old fool of the Callaway River had more visitors than he knew what to do with. He was awkward about it. He never did get easy with thanks. But he'd nod and he'd offer them coffee, and Gideon would thump his tail. The angels never forgot him. That chapter made it a thing every single year on the anniversary of the storm to ride back up that gravel road. 40 bikes, then fewer as the years took some of them, then the sons and daughters of the ones who'd passed. They'd camp on the knoll under the cross. They'd cook for the old man and tell the story to anybody new who'd come along so it wouldn't die. They called him Doc. They called him Brother. The man who had nobody for 40 years ended his life with more family than most men ever get, and not one of them was related to him by anything but the night the river rose. Sila's lived 8 more years. When he passed in his own bed in his own shack, with Gideon Gray and Ancient on the floor beside him, and he was not alone, because 3 of those bikers had driven through the night to sit with him at the end. They buried him on the knoll, right at the foot of the cross he'd raised with hands that wouldn't close, facing the river he'd watched for half a century. That cross still stands. They've replaced the wood twice now, but it stands at the bend, pale against the dark, and on stormy nights the folks along the Callaway say you can see it catch the lightning and throw it back, the way it did the night it saved 40 men. You think about that old man, down on his knees in the mud, gathering up his cedar one board at a time while the world laughed at him from the road. He didn't know what that cross was for. He just knew he had to build it. And maybe that's the truth this whole story leaves us with. The people the world calls broken, the ones it looks straight through, are so often the ones quietly doing the one thing that's going to matter most. You just don't see it. Not until the storm comes. Not until the river rises and the dark closes in, and you find yourself climbing toward a light somebody lit for no reason but love. Sila's cruise was never the broken old fool. He was the only man for 40 miles who knew that a hand reached down in the rain is the closest thing to God there is. And 40 hardened men learned his name on the worst night of their lives, and they never let the world forget it again. Rest easy, Doc. The cross is still standing, and so is every soul you saved. Word count, 4,985 words, inside the 4,805,200 target. What I cut, only redundant phrasing in the middle, the doubled to understand the man lead-in, a few trailing summary clauses in the church and coffin scenes, one repeated sensory aside about the riverbank, and a couple of, in a way none of them could have imagined, style tags. No beats removed. The 150-word hook is byte for byte unchanged. The false calm still closes the cross-raising. The storm still triggers the turn. The CTA still lands after the first payoff, and the ending stands word for word. No ellipses anywhere, single dots only.